Well, it's launch day for NVIDIA's RTX 3090. I have no idea what to expect in terms of availability, but I can tell you that as of right now, filming this video, which is ahead of the launch, obviously, there are people lined up outside Micro Centers and Best Buys all across the nation trying to get their hands on one. So I'm really curious as to see what the actual hype is amongst buyers when it comes to the graphics card, not this one, but the new 3090, which is starting at about $1,500. We did some extra tests for this review, stuff that we don't normally do, stuff that might make me sound smarter than you guys are used to, so I'm gonna try to do my best to screw it up in some way. Don't worry, I'm already screwing up my words, because I was up till 2 a.m. benchmarking and then up again at like 7 this morning, and I'm too old for 5 hours sleep. I'm sure plenty of you are just like wishing you got 5 hours sleep and are also wishing that I would just get through the ad or whatever so we can get in to the damn benchmarks. Get off my lawn. You know what, guys? I got new merch. It's available now, crowdme.com/JC Cents. We got zip-up hoodies, we got tri-blend, we got a new logo. I digress. Since 2012, it's a digress logo. You guys have been asking for that. Anyway, we got all kinds of stuff. Zip-up hoodies, beanies, polos. Don't take my word for it, because obviously I can't do this ad. So just look in the description below and you guys will find the link. Thanks. So it's pretty obvious that the RTX 3090 is positioned to be the biggest, baddest version of the 30 series, as of September 24th anyway, of just availability when it comes to the new Ampere architecture. What I have on the table right here is the Turing architecture. This was basically the pinnacle. This was where they sort of stopped in terms of how far they could push that Turing die. We've got the Titan RTX card right here, which has got, I've got my notes because my brain is not gonna remember this stuff, 4,608 CUDA cores, 72 Gen 1 RT cores, or the first gen RT cores, 576 Gen 2 tensor cores. So the reason why I'm reading the specs is it's important to kind of see where we've come in one generation's top tier with the launch offering of a shaved down version of Ampere versus the unshaved, as far as we know, unshaved Turing architecture, and to see how far they've come. So these are actually Gen 2 tensor cores because Gen 1 was actually in Titan Volta, which was never really a mainstream card or even readily available. 24 gigabytes of G6 memory or GDDR6, and it's on TSMC's 12 nanometer FinFET architecture. But up until now, the RTX 3080 is the only thing we really had to talk about with this launch because of this really interesting staggered launch. So if we compare the specs between the RTX Titan, it says 8,704 CUDA cores. Now, it's important to remember as we talk about CUDA core count, and yes, I'm gonna show you benchmarks, but I want to arm you with information and understanding the charts. So please bear with me on this. CUDA core is specific to FP32 instructions. So not all games use FP32 the most efficient, some more efficient than others, which is why you see some graphics cards or some NVIDIA cards do really well on certain titles and not as well in others, depending on the title's optimizations for who spends more money to get their technologies more featured in the game. And it's unfortunate, but it's the way that it works. You got AMD titles, NVIDIA titles, and so forth. Moving on, it's got, like I said, nearly double the CUDA cores as you'd find in the RTX Titan, and that does not necessarily mean it's going to be double the performance. And we already showed that when it was the 3080 versus the 2080 Ti, which has a few less CUDA cores than the RTX Titan. This has Gen 2 RT cores. So although it's got 68 Gen 2 RT cores, which is 4 less than the RTX Titan, they are newer, more efficient, faster RT cores. So that's one thing you need to keep in mind when you look at these charts. 272 Gen 3 tensor cores versus 576 Gen 2 in the RTX Titan. So significantly less tensor cores. However, Gen 3 and with DLSS 2.0, we are obviously seeing a fantastic uplift in DLSS performance as well as how those tensor cores are leveraged. But it's got 10 gigabytes of G6X memory, which is clearly faster than GDDR6, but significantly less of it, 24 gigabytes. It's important to remember that this card, with the amount of VRAM and such that's in it, really was directed towards the workstation type of workload. Anyone that's doing 3D, why a little piece of cardboard here? 3D rendering, stuff like that. Not video rendering, 3D rendering, where it can eat up VRAM very quickly. That's why it's 24 gigs of it. But more importantly, we are now on Samsung's 8 nanometer architecture, no longer on TSMC, no longer on FinFET. So that's why we got Big Chungus here. Ugh, you versus the guy she says she's leaving you for. So if we go ahead and just set these up right here, because this is a really fun representation of the size of the card. We've got 10,496 CUDA cores, 82 Gen 2 RT cores, 328 Gen 3 tensor cores, which is funny because that's still more than 200, almost 250 less than the RTX Titan, 24 gigabytes of G6X, and the same architecture. It's Samsung's 8 nanometer. So let's just go ahead and get right into the gaming benchmarks, because I know that's what a lot of people want to know. It's $1,500 versus $700. So how does it perform in games? Well, as you can see in games, it's an uplift of about 15% average across the board for more than twice the money. So that means obviously from a gaming standpoint, there is really no incentive to go and buy this card, unless you fall under two categories. And that is the gamer that is like, I want the best no matter what it costs. I don't care about the exponential costs at a very diminished return, which is clearly what this is. You know, more than 100% more money for 15% more performance. Well, you know, how much faster is that Bugatti gonna be versus, or that Chiron gonna be versus a Veyron? Well, you're gonna pay for it. I know it was a really bad analogy, but the bottom line is for people that want the best, that extra few percent it takes to get takes more yield to try and manufacture. I don't think people realize 10,496 CUDA cores on a new manufacturing process or a new wafer. The yields on this are usually pretty low. But it seems like Samsung's doing a pretty good job, because let's not forget, although this is $1,500, this is $2,500. This is $1,000 less than this, giving you the uplift that you saw in games. So if you already have this card, you're clearly going to be interested in this card because you are that type of consumer. But there's another person that this card really speaks to, and I said that you fall in two categories, and that's going to be the professional CAD drawer, the artist, the person that's doing very high-end animations, which is why we did a whole new workflow this time around featuring RTX Titan, the RTX 3080, as well as our RTX 3090. And then we also included one of the AIB variants here, and you probably noticed that in the gaming benchmarks. This is the MSI Gaming X Trio, which is basically their flagship card. You can kind of see in the size comparison, the RTX 3090 Founders Edition card looks bigger because it's more squared off, whereas there's a lot of like curves and stuff to the 3090. God, weight-wise though, ugh. You want to go moose clubbing? You can do it with this guy. But anyway, we wanted to kind of see how the FE card compares to some of the variants. The MSI card actually comes in at $1,589.99. So it's $90 more than this guy. And as you noticed in the gaming benchmarks, and again, we'll get to the professional workflow here in a second, there was a couple of percent more, usually 1, maybe 2 FPS more on the MSI card. And the reason for that is although it has a locked power limit at this point, it only goes to 102% power draw. The baseline on the MSI card when we were doing wattage testing was more like 380 watts. And although it is a 350 watt TDP card, The 100% baseline for power draw on the MSI card is uplifted. The problem is you can't really go any farther because 102 doesn't give you much. So the 350 watt baseline on the Founders card actually gives you 115% total, so that you can get about 400 watts out of this card. So overclocking wise, this card is going to beat this card only because this card isn't giving you any extra available power limit. You can move the slider all you want, you're not going to get any extra core. What's going to happen is if you get a reduction in load, then the core shoots up real fast and then you get a crash because it goes beyond where its stable mark is going to be. So moving on to what I said, category number 2, the guy that does CAD drawings, does 3D modeling, or in this case, we're going to specifically talk about animation. We used Blender right here, and we used more Blender tests than we ever have. And I asked Phil, I said, who uses Blender? And he's like, well, people that do animations and stuff use Blender. And I had no idea that Blender, I thought it was literally a benchmark people came out with so that you could test stuff like this on CPUs and CUDA and optics and all of that. And that's one thing to point out too, is all of these renders in Blender were done with the optics encoder, which is an NVIDIA technology. They also are happening now on the, I believe we were told their RT cores are doing the renders now, which is part of what optics is, leveraging the RT cores, not just doing CUDA. And so all of these cards do have optics available to them. It's just we're going to clearly see a generational gap in terms of performance between them. So we did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Blender tests, as well as the Octane multi-head test, which is another specific render capability of NVIDIA's graphics cards with large frame buffer. We're talking about workloads that will exceed the 10 gigabytes available on the 3080. So let's go ahead and show you what the generational improvement is with the RTX Titan versus the 3080, the guy that's like, I'm gonna use this card for rendering as well, versus the mega monster, the 3090 Founders Edition. So Blender BMW, Blender Classroom, Blender Fishy Cat, Blender Coro, and Blender Junk Shop. So Junk Shop was actually the frame that was provided to us from NVIDIA to do a test for large memory workflow. And that's because that scene is intended to use as much VRAM as capable. Now, it's not going to exceed the 24 gigabytes as available on either the RTX Titan or the 3090. It does, however, exceed the available on the 3080. So that's why you might have noticed there's 2 crashes on there for the 3080, and that's simply because that frame was created under obviously different working conditions and then tried to be rendered on a card that doesn't actually meet the VRAM available to the scene that's necessary. So as it starts to render, it eats up that VRAM and then it crashes because the VRAM runs out. And the way it does that, it goes, oh no, and then it shuts down the program that's utilizing all that VRAM to keep it from completely borking itself. As a very bad way of explaining it, but that's exactly what happens. So that's why it says crash on those. Now that's why I also included Blender BMW, Classroom, Fishy Cat, and Coro, because those are scenes that do not exceed the 10 gigabytes available on the 3080. So rather than just using scenes that were provided to us that are gonna obviously make the 3090 look really good because they can exceed the 10 gigabytes, I wanted to still see what the difference in performance was between the shaved down version of Ampere versus the 3090, which is still shaved, let's be honest here. And you can see that there's a pretty significant improvement across the board, depending on the test. Blender BMW is not that demanding anymore. In fact, the 3090 does it in 9 seconds. The 3080 does it in 11, that's 2 seconds. But remember, that's 2 seconds per frame. And don't forget, this is not just ray tracing and doing shadows and all that sort of stuff and global illumination and whatever all the technologies that are being used in these frames are. That's one frame of a movie. For instance, if we talk about Blender Spring, which unfortunately 3080 wasn't able to handle, this is a movie. In fact, what you're seeing right now is exactly the movie as you would see it watching it in TV. However, the way it actually looks before it's rendered is very basic. All the math and all the geometry has to be applied to the shapes and the objects that are in the scene, and then the final render does all of the calculations. So if you take a look at the workload on this one, or take a look at the timeline, it's pretty insane. It still exceeds the 10 gigabytes available to the RTX 3080. However, not by much. It only took about 12 gigabytes of VRAM to render that scene. I was able to get through a lot of it on the 3080. Eventually it crashed. But as you can see, as you take away the 3080 and you compare the RTX Titan versus the 3090, on Spring, it takes about 80 seconds to perform on the 3090. 80 seconds to render that one frame of that movie that we just showed you. But it takes 166 seconds or more than 100% extra time than it takes on the RTX Titan. Now don't forget, just a few months ago, this was the biggest, baddest middle card you could get for that person that is a gamer and also uses these types of workflows. So believe it or not, this one card could be a pretty badass workstation card, and that when you're done, go play some Doom Inferno or something on it. Was it Inferno? Eternal. Eternal, whatever.
You want to play the Doom Inferno.
But just for kicks and shiggles.
Just for kicks and
shiggles. It's family friendly now. I wanted to see what would happen if we rendered these same frames on my 10900K overclocked to 5.2 gigahertz. As you can see, it's pretty... Can you even see the number for the graphics cards with how long it is for the CPU? I can tell you the only one it couldn't run actually was the Octane, and that's because that specifically requires a graphics card. But yeah, you can see now why the massive frame buffer exists on these cards. And given the fact that we're on a new architecture and we are on new memory, because remember this is stacked memory, it's not 3D memory, but it is stacked in terms of getting it all to fit in there because it's a shorter PCB and stuff. I think it's pretty interesting seeing how far this generation has come. If you're using these graphics cards in those workflows, the 3090 definitely exists in a stopgap between a gaming card and like a Quadro. And the fact that you saw that level of uplift at $1,000 less, or only $300 more than a 2080 Ti, imagine what it would do to that in this test, paints a pretty strong picture for the 3090's existence. Now I know no matter what I just said, all people are hearing is paid shill, paid shill, paid shill. No, I wasn't paid to do this video. I didn't get in on the 8K videos. But what I can tell you is for the first time, for me sitting down and spending until, I don't know how many hours yesterday, I started testing at 9 a.m., maybe a little bit sooner than that technically, and then until 2 in the morning, I was testing these cards. And I spent more time on the professional workflow stuff because it was actually really exciting to see what this one frame looks like and how long it takes, and it gives you a new perspective of appreciation, I think, when you watch a really cool animated movie, like something from Pixar, or any of the new animated movies that just, I think people take for granted as to how good the animation looks because of the availability of technologies that you find on these graphics cards. And don't forget, these are the baby brothers of the ones that are being created in the render farms. That's why movies like Lego Movie took a year to render. A year render time. That's not animation time, that's render time. But you know what else I think is exciting? Is the fact that we're gonna also do a thing right now to see where we end up. So we're gonna see where we end up on the leaderboard because we're kicking off Rip GN once again, and I'm pretty sure he's kicking off Rip J. So we already showed with the 3080 that with our custom cooling apparatus, my Blowimatron 5000, we were able to get up to number 9 at 12,387 with our GeForce RTX 3080. Keep in mind that is a stock card, so is that one, and so is that one. But those two are LN2, these are all LN2 2080s, and a lot of these are LN2 2080s. Let's see where stock out of the box gets us. And this is not gonna be an overclocking guide or anything, this is just for fun. All I've done right now is crank the fans up a little bit to 74%. Do some Port Royal here. We'll do a custom run. By clicking custom run, it won't upload the results. If I upload the results right now, I'd be in trouble because I would leak it. But then again, apparently people need to follow embargo dates anyway. Now it's important to note, like I said, we're not uploading the score right now and I did a custom run so it doesn't even try, but at 13,523 would get us number 3 without even trying to overclock it. So here's the thing. The cooler on this, and I didn't even talk about this in our review, only got as hot as about 50C. Again, with the user-defined fan curve, which is how I test all of my cards. 50C. I mean, Big Chungus is clearly doing big work because of the fact that it's running ridiculously cool. In fact, it's slightly cooler than the 3090 Gaming X Trio card, which is a triaxial card with 3 fans. So we just got a 14,323. Number one right now is currently 14,131, and we've not done anything to it yet. Unfortunately, we had a crash, and I think that's because we pushed that clock to 125 like I showed you, and we know that temperature equals stability. All right, this is literally the most efficient design we've made yet. So if you're curious as to what the inside looks like, there it is. We've got a fan pushing directly on the card, and we've got a ramp pushing the cold air from our air conditioner right up onto the card. And I love my little access hole right here. This is for the power button. And so here's my Blowimatron 5000 NOS edition. We need the NOS because the 3090 needs that much more air for the air fuel mixture. We're down to 11C on the core. And it's not even at idle, it's at 1695 megahertz because I have it under that, prefer maximum performance. So this is the same setting that crashed, 125 and 600. I want to see if the temperature got a stability with those particular settings, and if so, that might just be where we land. Under load, it was at 38. All right, so that gives us a 14,524. I can't wait to get. There's the problem. This is my personal card. I'm gonna use it in a build, but it's doing so good. 14,607. 1,000 or 2,175 is the little peak boost. We think it does this little like bink at the end for like a little stability check at the end of the test. Like if you make it to there and then you fail, oh. But look, 2175 is what it went to. Its max temperature with the air conditioner, 43. There's no way it can hit 2200. What do I have to lose? Just keep going for it? Well, we've kind of found where our limit is with the AC, and I gotta tell you right now, I am pretty thoroughly impressed. So we actually got a 14,633 as our best score with just the air conditioner. Remember, there's no shunt mods, no liquid metal mods, none of that stuff. No hard mod of any sort. That's just make it cold, and all its limits in place, no custom BIOS or nothing. So let's talk about whether or not the 3090 is worth it. The AIB cards are gonna pretty much all be more expensive, even by just a couple of bucks at the very least, because I think it's gonna be they're gonna have a really hard time, I think, competing with the FE. A lot of you might be wondering why we didn't use the MSI card for this attempt right here. And I started to talk about it earlier. This card only goes up to 102% power limit. Now that's not 2% over 350, that's 2%, yeah, it's like why even bother with the 2%? But that's 2% over its uplift, which is actually closer to about 370 watts. So it's already about 20 watts higher TDP than stock. So 102% of 370 is higher than 102% of 350, right? But this card gives us 114%, or 14% more than 350. So that's why we were able to get actually about 400 watts, about 395 watts out of this card. So we would have hit power limit on this and not gotten the score that you saw there. That's why you see people do hacked BIOS and custom hard mods and stuff to trick these cards into overclocking farther. So if you're an extreme overclocker, you're gonna have to run these cards if you want to get on the leaderboards. It's just, there's no way around it. They are the fastest cards. That's why a lot of the custom Titan RTX cards are on the leaderboards, as well as the like Kingpin 2080 Ti's and stuff. But most people don't care about this. This is just a hobby for us and something to do. The 3090s though, if you want the best absolute possible gaming performance you can have today anyway, as of the launch of this video, the 3090 is gonna give it to you. It gives you a massive frame buffer at 24 gigabytes of G6X, as we already talked about, allowing you to do very professional workloads that will utilize that memory bandwidth that can still run fast enough in the instructions that are available to this card. Now this card does obviously have some locked features on it that are available on the Quadro series cards that run the same Ampere architecture. And those cards are gonna cost you thousands and thousands of dollars because that's exactly what they're designed for. Those are cards that actually perform very poorly in games if you tried, simply because the BIOS are not optimized for that type of workload. They're very different needs. But it's funny, I have no doubt people are already typing angry comments about $1,500, that's ridiculous. you can choose to look at this a couple of different ways. It's $1,000 less than this, and it absolutely curb stomps this card in every possible way. This card curb stomps the RTX Titan in every possible way if it fits in the 10 gigabyte frame buffer, which is why I guess there's rumors about potentially higher frame buffers available to certain cards. We don't really comment on whether or not we think that's happening. That's neither here nor there. We talk about what's available now and what's coming out. But you can also say the 3090 is only about $300 more than the 2080 Ti is. So you can either say, oh, it's more, or it's way less, depending on the perspective you look at it. Average gamers are not gonna get their money's worth out of this card, unless money is truly no object and you want that extra 15% at whatever it costs. Well, here you go, they're available to you. Well, maybe. Unfortunately, NVIDIA just put out a comment saying they're very excited to see how interested people are in 3090. However, given the limited target range of who these cards are targeted after, like I just said, people fall into one of these two categories or maybe both, means there are less available 3090s than there were 3080s. And we already saw how that launch went. I really, really hope that something happened between the 3080 and now to circumvent some of the measures that some of these bots and stuff have gone through, or these companies running these bots have gone to try and snag up these cards. I mean, it's probably the norm for us now. So what card are you gonna get? Are you still holding off for RDNA 2? Were none of these cards ever an option for you and you're really waiting for 3070? Or are you just sticking with what you already got? Comment down below how you guys feel about the 3090 and what card you're interested in the future. And if you could upgrade to any card that's reasonable for you, what would it be? Thanks for watching, guys. And as always, we'll see you in the next one.